Event. Before I introduce today's panel, I just want to remind you that on your table there's a card you can fill out, so we'll be sure to let you know of future Wilson Center on the Hill events. And there are in fact two coming up. On June 23rd, we're going to be taking a look at the Canadian banking system, that our northern neighbor has managed to waltz through this financial turmoil with a great deal of bank stability. And we want to find out how they did it, why they did it, and see what lessons we can learn as we're starting to think about a new financial regulatory regime, not only here, but really around the world. And then on June 26th, we return more explicitly to the question of development. John Sewell will be the key feature. He was the longtime head of the Overseas Development Council and has thought really more and more deeply about development and where development strategy needs to go than really just virtually anybody in town. Well, today's subject, this question of education, is so fundamental to the future of the country that I'm delighted and yet not surprised to see that we had to keep adding chairs as people were expressing interest. If we don't get education right, we won't be the country that we want to be. We won't be the leader that much of the world expects us to be. And we really have had the pleasure at the Wilson Center of meeting with the Einstein Fellows over the last couple years. And they have been not only educators in the classroom, but they certainly have been educators of us. And our ability to get a sense of people who are really on the front line of education has been just invaluable, and we wanted to bring them up here to give you the same experience. I'm just going to very briefly introduce them. You all have their biographies on the back of the invitation flyer, and then I'll ask them to say a little bit about themselves and what they do, and in particular what they've done over the course of the year or 2 years here in Washington as Einstein Fellows. I must say I have an active fantasy life that someday I'll be an Einstein Fellow, but it doesn't look too likely, actually. Well, let me start to my far right, your far left, Stephen Scannell. He's a teacher from Oregon, a science teacher. This is the Oregon caucus here. Karen Steiner, right next to him, is a math teacher from Bend, Oregon. My name is Kent Hughes. I run a program at the Wilson Center on Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy, and I'm from Pendleton, Oregon, so there we are. To my left and your immediate right is Ed Potosnak. He is a science teacher, chemistry teacher from New Jersey. And further to your right is Jennifer Thompson, who hails from Alaska. And not surprisingly, is working on a polar project here in town. So why don't we start just in the order that I introduced everybody, say a word or two more about yourself, and then what you think you've learned here in your year or 2 years in Washington.
I started teaching about 15 years ago, first as a substitute in Portland, where I had a chance to teach all grades, all subjects, and all schools, from very successful schools to schools in crisis that we sometimes recognize by reading in the paper. I then moved out to a town that was about 80 miles to the nearest bank machine, and the high school had 85 students, and the whole school district was about 225 students. And I had a fabulous experience over 4 years where I really learned what can really happen in a small school and small environment, both with the positives and then the negatives. And then I moved to just outside the Portland area to Gresham High School, where a student body of about 1,800. And I had a chance to really see kind of how a big school functions, and also make those comparisons between big schools and small schools. And many of you are probably familiar with the Gates Foundation small school grants. We actually applied for that and didn't get it. But I understood what kind of was going on with the small school thing, and probably due to the situation, it worked out fine. I've taught physics, IB physics. As a teacher, I've taught what we call regular freshman science as well as the honors science, and come from a culture where all teachers in our science department try to teach the freshman, sophomore levels, plus have some honors or advanced upper division classes so that we balance a workload that makes people sane and happy and excited about their jobs. I've been involved with charter schools, most recently last year with a elementary charter school, Montessori charter school in my school district, which got approved. And when I return in September, my students will be students in that charter school. Also in my school district, we've done some creative things with a couple other high schools with joint responsibilities where students stay in one high school and then move to a technical school, one around healthcare and engineering, and then the latest one actually connected with the labor unions around electricians, construction, architecture, and metalworking. And so I'm a true believer that students need to do in order to learn, and that all of this education reform, the real scary part is if we get more book learning only and less doing. So I'm really excited about what's happening, and have had a wonderful year. Sorry, that took a long.
Good morning, good afternoon, I guess. My name's Karen Steiner. As Ken had mentioned, I am a second-year Einstein Fellow. This year I'm here on the Hill with the Science and Technology Committee in the Research and Science Education Subcommittee. Last year was with Department of Energy in their workforce development for teachers and scientists. And I think that my experience in education is a little bit different, not too different from a lot of teachers, though. I'm a second career teacher. My first career was in aerospace, and then I think I understood value added and decided to go into teaching. I went back to school, got my credential for teaching, and started where every new teacher starts, in the barrio in San Diego. And I taught 8th grade math, science, and Spanish. Albeit I'm a mathematics teacher, but obviously in inner city and high need schools, you teach what they need you to teach. So after that experience, I then had moved to Bend, Oregon, which is very different than the inner city. And so again, I had a different experience, very I guess suburban, if you will, and teaching 7th and 8th grade mathematics. At that opportunity, I was able to do a one-year master's thesis with my sister, and we did a collaborative action research project to really see how students learn, how they learn mathematics, especially at the middle school level. We went away from desks and what we call in education cemetery sitting, that you're quiet, you don't say anything, you listen to me because I know everything, to the fact that I'm here to facilitate your learning. I don't know everything. We'll learn this together. We'll problem solve. We'll create. We'll innovate. And we'll collaborate. And as I look out into this room, I literally see my classroom because I got rid of all my desks. So did my sister, and we got round tables. And it looks like my class. You're just a little older, but it kind of looks like my class. So kind of good to be back in this environment. No. But anyway, so I think that my experiences from business and industry, from an inner city barrio experience, moving into a different school district that's in a sense somewhat rural, I guess, because in Central Oregon we don't have the industry, we don't have a lot of the institutes of higher education in our backyard or the industry support. It was very what do I want to say, much a service industry where we were. And coming to Washington, D.C., it has been the most incredible experience for the last 2 years to be a teacher voice of what's happening on the ground, in the classroom, in both an agency and then also on the Hill. And I want to say that agency folks have listened, and sometimes I have been a broken record. Here on the Hill, people have listened, and they want to know, and I think really, truly, we need to know what's happening in the schools from the practitioner viewpoint. So I'm excited for today. Thanks.
Ed?
Ed Potosnak from New Jersey. A little bit about my experience. I didn't know I was going to be a teacher. I actually thought I was going to be a lawyer until I started taking courses required in the political science area. And then I'm here now on the Hill for 2 years as a second-year fellow in the office of Congressman Honda. And my legislative slate includes education as well as the environment, global warming, water, the interior, national parks. And it's really been quite a fun ride and also a very challenging one. It's very different from being in front of the classroom. And I will echo Karen's sentiments in that people do listen. There are unique opportunities for someone with an education background to share their experience and also question some of the legislation and things that agencies are doing with programs to make them improve, to refine them. And I thank you all for being here as part of that, both as advocacy groups and members of Congress as their representatives. I also want to thank the Wilson Center, Kent and Jacqueline, for having us. It's just another way to have a conversation. We represent a very diverse community of teachers. My school was about 2,700 students, 7 full-time chemistry teachers alongside of me. In the Einstein Fellowship, some fellows that aren't here today are the entire math department, right? So we'll try our best to kind of give you a little bit of experience from their experiences, but generally we represent very specific points of view. The great thing about the fellowship program is we can build off of each other's knowledge in these diverse communities from different states, from previous years and the current year, to understand better what's happening out there in the classroom. And I also wanted to thank the Department of Energy, which hosts the Einstein Fellowship Program through the Office of Workforce Development for Teachers and Scientists. Without their support, we wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't have this opportunity. Sort of reflecting on the year, and then last year, the education challenges that our nation faces are very vast. And it is complicated. There certainly is a lot of passion to solve what we call a problem. But I think it's also important to recognize a lot of really great things are happening in schools. And as we move forward in new directions for some of the students that are disproportionately affected by poor schools, schools that aren't doing well or are high performing, we recognize that those changes and the focus there doesn't undermine what's happening and positively in so many great schools that we have. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have and providing that perspective as a classroom teacher, and I'll try to keep the policy part of my role here in the last couple of years aside and reflect back on the classroom. In addition to being in a high school classroom, I also was an adjunct faculty member at Rutgers University for pre-service and in-service teacher training, focusing on how to use technology to teach science. With a digital student, we didn't learn that way. At least I didn't, even though I kind of was born on a computer, I say. How we can engage students that they live on the computer. They weren't just born on it. And that's also a challenge for us, even for some of our digital learners that are becoming teachers today, because their teachers didn't teach them with technology. So that was a little bit of my focus in the higher education realm and teacher training.
My name is Jennifer Thompson, and I'm a kindergarten first grade teacher from Juneau, Alaska. I've taught for the last 10 years in a primary classroom, so 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. My background, I'm certified K-8, but I have a specialty in early childhood. So my focus this year has been to inform my middle school and high school teachers about what it looks like in the elementary school, because it is really different. I teach all subjects as well as social skills in a very big way. So when kids first come to school, it's not only the children that you're teaching, it's also their families. So giving them information about how to advocate for their child. And unlike Karen, this classroom doesn't look anything like what mine would look like, because kids would be up and moving around. So I'm at the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. And one of my biggest projects this year has been to work on a project of bringing Denmark, Greenland, and U.S. together for an education project in Greenland. And so this summer I go for the second time. I got to go last summer as kind of a preview of my program. And bringing high school teachers and students from those three countries together to learn about climate change and what's happening at the summit of Greenland. And climate change has actually been one of my passions this year. I've been to meetings and briefings and conferences as often as I can to learn as much about climate change education. How can we inform not only middle school and high school, but also elementary, because our young children hear those words a lot, and they hear the worries that parents may give, or community members, or what people are saying about in the newspaper or TV. So that's been one of my projects this year, and I feel like I'll take a lot of information back to Alaska when I go next fall. My new job, instead of a classroom teacher, is I'm going to be a science coach for elementary teachers and children. So I'll be modeling science lessons as well as working with teachers to help them bring about a better science curriculum in our elementary schools.
Well, thank you all. And I must mention that as we start talking substance and questions and so forth, that all the panelists here are really speaking for themselves, not their departments or even their home school districts, or not certainly their current bosses. Well, what I'd like to do is just pose a couple questions and then get a brief response from the panel, and then we'll move to your questions before too long. You're all in, or have been in, different departments. I know there are Einstein Fellows at NASA, at NSF, I think at NIST, at DOE, and so forth. And all of these institutions, and of course including the Department of Education, have a real interest in math science education. Is there something the Congress could or should do in terms of encouraging greater coordination in the approach to math science education in the executive branch?
I'll start. Partly because my answer is twofold to that question. First of all, as I look out, and I mentioned that this looks a lot like my classroom, we are asking our students to embody 21st century skills. We're asking them to work together, to collaborate, to problem solve, to think critically in order to solve the problems of the future, in order to innovate, obviously for economic reasons as well. And again, as teachers, we have to do that same thing. We have to collaborate, coordinate, and critically problem solve in order to help our teachers to learn those skills. But do we actually ask the federal government to do those same things? And I think after the 2 years that I've been here, I'm from looking at agency perspective and looking at the federal government congressional perspective, is that we don't ask our agencies enough to collaborate. We don't ask them to coordinate. And I guess coordinate, then collaborate, the next step up. I do want to say then on the second fold to that is our Committee for Science and Technology has introduced legislation that will do that thing, that will actually ask the federal agencies to coordinate STEM education programs through the Office of Science and Technology Policy. That's Bill 1709 that should be on the floor either this week or next week. But the hope is that that will actually really, I don't want to say force, but that will actually push the agencies to make a greater step toward that coordination, because all of your members and your constituents, they need to see more of the programs that are available through the federal government that touch the classroom. They need to get down to the classroom level. And all too often we don't see that happening. I've been involved in a project over the last year at looking at 6 agencies that have science missions and looking at their STEM programs, whether they're activities or education programs, but actually science, technology, engineering, and science, technology, engineering, mathematics for the classroom. And it actually reaches, and their open access is to the institutes of higher education. There's obviously the federal government We have 15,000 school districts. We have approximately 4,000 institutes of higher education, of which 2,300 of them are four-year institutions. It's a lot simpler to work with four-year institutions, 4,000 versus 15,000 entities. I do understand that. But if there's some way that we can get down to that classroom level, I think that's what we need to do.
Just jump in there as well. This is a role that resonates with me as a classroom teacher. When I came here to Washington, one of the things when they said you're going to be on the Hill, and I was like, what is that? I said, well, what can the federal government do? Where are they best positioned? And to leverage federal programs to help schools be more efficient is clearly a role that they can have. And there's about, when Karen finishes her project, we'll have a better sense, but the American Competitiveness Council got together, and there's about $3 billion spent every year on STEM education across more than a dozen agencies, and they're not coordinated. So that's a lot of money going out there in lots of different ways without any unified vision for how it's going to affect STEM education. And if it's that important for STEM education to be sound for our competitiveness, why is that? And so the Bill 1709 that Karen referred to really dovetails on a piece of legislation that I began working on with my boss and the staff over with Senator Obama, then now President Obama, called the Enhancing STEM Education Act, which in Section 1 provides some of the same provisions through the Office of Science Technology Policy to provide that coordination. This is from a study. It was their recommendation, and it's critical. We need to see that piece happen so that we're not duplicating efforts in the same vein. We're actually putting them together so they can reinforce what we have identified as the most helpful ways to improve STEM education and really give students more opportunities to be scientifically literate as citizens and maybe even work in some of these high-tech emerging fields, things that we can't even think of now, but they're in our classrooms right now, and we have to prepare them for that. And so it's a critical piece of the federal role on that.
Time for Stephen, anything to?
Well, I just want to add that I think a coordinated effort is important, and they mentioned the legislation, but having a one-size-fits-all, everyone does the same is not what we want. I think having diversity in what we do is the same thing as we talk about needing biodiversity for a strong ecosystem. Well, I think we need that for a strong STEM workforce. And then also, learning really is a people thing, right? We do things with our learning, and so the empowering people, both who are in the field, who are mentoring teachers, empowering teachers to move up to the field to learn new things, those are the types of things that we want to support and get people excited about STEM learning and STEM education and really creating the future.
The last piece for me was just the communication and the fact that as a teacher I've come and been able to talk to a lot of people and been listened to, which hasn't always been my experience in the classroom or in the district. And so I feel like a really huge piece of this collaboration will be communication and getting teachers to be able to give their opinions and see what is really happening, what is really coming into the classroom, because I think a lot of things that I had no idea about and now do, I can take those back to the state of Alaska. That's one of the things I plan to do, but I think the majority of teachers don't realize a lot of the programs that are out there. So,
if I could just say one more thing, is that it's not, I don't think that we're saying here, oh, the Department of Energy should be in education or so-and-so should be in education. No, but they should take their expertise in science and technology and their expertise in energy. NASA should take their expertise in climate and in space exploration. They should take their expertise to the classroom and to teachers and education. And this is education, it is collaboration. and making a stronger workforce. Obviously, these science mission directorates are worried about their workforce, and we should be. And education is one of those very keys to that educated workforce and the society as a whole. Let's not forget that teachers are really teaching students to be a member of society. It is not just what we had the 3 R's growing up and in our education when we were educated. It's a very different time nowadays. Remember that students are coming to the classroom without the 2 parents, without the mother at home, without the economic and the stability that maybe we had or we didn't have. But students today are coming to the classroom for that counselor, that teacher, that parent, that community, and they're learning that in the classroom. So let's not forget that either.
One of the other things we hear a lot in terms of education is no child left behind. And Congress, sooner or later, will be reauthorizing or reconsidering No Child Left Behind. And if Congress were to make 3 changes in that act, what do you all think those changes ought to be? Or one change?
Well, I'll step up. As a scientist and a science teacher, I find it truly baffling why you would compare this year's students with next year's students when they're different students. So my big issue around No Child Left Behind is based on looking at this class at this point in time and this class at this point in time without knowing where those students started or where they're coming from. And so there's a move now to go to a growth model where instead of looking at what a student's test score is one year compared to a different student's last year, you look at how much the student has learned over time. And especially as we look at mobility issues around students, being able to look at individuals through time is what we need to be paying attention to. And that's what students need to be paying attention to, right? How much am I learning over the course of a year versus, where do I sit with last year's class? So the growth model is what I think is the number one change.
Okay, so I agree with that, the growth model. I also am concerned with assessment of only a certain way, so a one-size-fits-all assessment. I don't think it works. As a teacher of young children, I see artists, scientists, mathematicians, sculptors. I see all kinds of gifts when those children come in, and by 3rd grade, when those assessments start, I see a lot of kids shut down and are no longer really eager learners and really curious. It's in the spring, teaching shuts down, testing starts, and that's where the learning ends. And so I think that there's a lot of big needs actually to look at assessment pieces.
Jennifer, from the outside, I'm a taxpayer or a worried parent, and the teacher says, well, Sally's just been doing everything she can. She's got, terrific musical skills, but maybe not so good in math, science, and so forth. So how do I, from the outside, know that Sally's getting what she needs?
I think there's a lot of different ways to assess those skills and strategies and how kids learn. So as a teacher of young children, I don't use just one way to look at children. I look at them in lots of different ways. So to me, coming from the early childhood classroom, I'm talking to parents a lot, all during the year, not just right after an assessment, but it truly is looking at a whole child and the environment that they're in and where they come from.
For a Washington audience, I have to point out that when Jennifer looked at all the talents among her students, she didn't identify any lawyers.
I think one of the things, too, is we don't always look at, when we're looking at assessments, which is a huge issue, right? How do we assess how schools are doing? We don't, right now, under the current system, put a lot of emphasis on what the schools are providing to the students, right? It's sort of a product approach. So we test in language arts and mathematics, and then that, we assume, indicates how well the school is doing. But we're not necessarily adjusting for the climate. We're not counting access to different sort of support mechanisms that students need, right, and that teachers need. So that's an area really that I think when you look at multiple indicators or something like that, where you can get into evaluating or valuing a school based on what matters or helps for education. Personally, I think counting science, we're here as science and math teachers. Every state has, it's an easy change, it's an easy addition, has been required to come up with science standards and assessments. They just don't count right now for AYP. Or in California API. And we can do more in other subject areas too. I think Jennifer's right. But that's an easy one sort of to add. It's like a low-hanging fruit. So assessments that measure what we value, in the different subject areas. And maybe that they look at critical thinking and problem solving, collaboration, as well as valuing arts and music and social studies, history, civics. I think there's a big opportunity for us in reauthorization to look at our ELL population and our students with disabilities, our special education under IDEA, and reconcile those programs. So we're valuing where they are and measuring their success, maybe differently, probably differently, but still counting it, that schools that are investing a lot of resources here are getting credit, right? That's what it's about, that they're showing mom and dad taxpayer that they're working for their kids every day. Because teachers are there, and they're fighting very hard on behalf of students. And it shouldn't be fighting against the assessments or fighting against the standards. It should be fighting for the students. And so that has to change too. And can I list 4? Is that okay? So the fourth one is not punitive, right? It's trying to be supportive so that struggling schools can make a huge growth in the education that they provide rather than be punished. I think it's something like 1% is held back. That's the punishment. It's just the wrong attitude to have. For teachers, it comes across, like you're not valued, and that's a problem, as well as the whole community, including the students, ultimately.
In California, and you either taught math or language arts or science through math or social studies through language arts, and it's good to coordinate your curriculum, yes, and to have interdisciplinary curriculum, but not at the expense of teacher pitted against teacher. And that's the problem. That's what actually happened in the schools. But the intent is absolutely right. It is correct. It is good, and it is what we want. But it's actually the implementation that wherein lies the problem.
Well, thank you all. Let's go to your questions, and we always give a priority to congressional staff if we can. Please just introduce yourself. Sure. We'll have a microphone for you.
Oh, thank you.
Right there.
Thank you for your comments. Is this on? Does this work? Can you hear me?
It doesn't amplify the room.
Okay. Ellen Carlin with the House Homeland Security Committee. Thank you for your comments. I was interested as I came to the Hill as a AAAS scientific fellow. And so some of your comments have really resonated. And having gone to a science high school and seen a lot of my classmates move on in their lives with really no interest in science and sometimes not even an understanding of science, which I found pretty shocking since they had spent 4 years in a high school, it seems to me that the solution to the problem has to start at a much earlier age than high school, even in kindergarten. And I think in a lot of schools, elementary schools, including my own, science was something that you did once or twice a week. It was an event. You went to see the science teacher for an hour on a Tuesday. And it seems to me that if science were integrated in the classroom every single day, it would solve a lot of the problems that we talked about, like how, in the spring, we're just teaching to the exam, we're teaching to the language arts exam or the math exam. Whereas I think through science, we can be teaching kids how to read, how to do math, how to do all of those things. And it would also seem to me would solve some of the workforce problems. If you could engender an interest in science at a much younger age, children would be less scared of it as they got older into the more difficult subjects. So how do you foster a culture that understands that concept, at the high policy making levels that science isn't just a subject that kids have to take, that it's a whole way of thinking and needs to be integrated into the whole learning philosophy. How do you foster that understanding and culture?
To your first part, I'm just going to say yes. There's a recent WestEd study that in the Bay Area, 20% of elementary school teachers are teaching zero science, and 50% are teaching less than an hour a week because they're trying to make time for math and language arts. So it's being, they call pushed out. So where you had it twice a week, some are getting zero, and some are getting even less than that. So that trend, if it continues, is sort of scary, considering, you know, we need to at least have some baseline. Not everyone's going to be turned on by high-level physics, sort of, maybe like how the quarks and tops and string theory and all that, right? Not everyone's going to want that detailed knowledge, but when they're voting, when they're buying a car, when they're throwing trash out, having some science is pretty helpful, right? So how do you foster that? I can only reflect a little bit. When I would tell people I was a teacher, they'd kind of nod. And when I said I taught chemistry, they'd go, oh, why is that? You know, why is teaching chemistry any different than teaching? And it's a real fundamental question. How do you get people to change their philosophy or their outlook, where science is hard, and therefore I must have something better than a regular teacher to be a science teacher? That's a tough question. I think we can do it by integrating the subject matter. We can do it by helping elementary school teachers not be afraid of science. I think part of it is that, not that they're not trained or smart enough, they're just not confident in science. A lot of their preparation maybe doesn't focus on that. And there's some models that are out there, like having elementary school specialists, like we have elementary school physical education instructors, right? That come in, or music teachers. We could have elementary school science teachers that have pull-outs for classes where they're confident and they know how to work with elementary school teachers and elementary school students to work collaboratively if they're nervous or scared about it. I'll look to my elementary school teacher colleague on how you change that climate early. But I think we all can do that too, and every level, to change the way that we look at it. That scientists are in lab coats, that math is not for girls. These are attitudes that need adjusting comprehensively.
Well, and I think, like you said before, if not that I'm really in favor of putting another subject with AYP until we figure out the assessment piece. But I do think that if we have that for science, then we're going to put more emphasis on science because it will be measured and will have some weight at the end, right? So, you know, in that way, I'd love to see science become very valued, and I'm completely in agreement with you. I think it should start in preschool, which it does. I already know that children are young scientists, and sometimes we take the scientists out of them by the time we put them at desks and push paper and pencil things on them, and they stop wondering about their world and curiosity that they come to the world with.
It's like when it gets hard, that curiosity starts to go.
Right. And so, you know, one of the things I have noticed is that I've asked a lot of people this year, because I'm working with a lot of scientists, and I'm like passionate about science now because I didn't have that when I grew up. I wasn't encouraged in math or science as a kid of the 60s. So now what I ask scientists a lot, it's like, well, what took you to science? And more often than not, it's a person or an experience that put them into the science world. Just this morning, I heard a speaker, and he said, you know, it was middle school, and he was handed the theory of relativity, and boom, it's like his world changed overnight. So I think teachers matter. That's what I'm coming back to, is that who kids have matters. And so the more that we can develop that really early, expose kids to what is science. It is incredible. It's intriguing. It's, you know, and then you just keep feeding that and fostering that, and teachers need professional development to be able to do that.
Yeah, I would agree on that, because it's also exposing teachers to the experiences. It's through that professional development. Just on a whim, actually selling a home, I met a dean of engineering at Oregon State University. And I told him I was a middle school math teacher. And he said, oh, we have a program for students to come and talk with high school students. I said, well, would they ever come talk to middle school students? So I had 2 young women engineers, sophomores in college, come to talk to my middle school students all day long. Every class, I said, I have 5 classes, I have 30 students in every class. Do you really want to spend the whole day? Oh, sure, sure, sure. Well, bless their hearts, they did. And one of the students was working on a water purification system in Ecuador, and the other one was working on a new membrane for kidney dialysis. Now, my middle school students, albeit it's math, again, I should be teaching math, and I was not teaching math that day, but what happened that day was extraordinary because it changed my students' lives, and the way it changed my life and how I taught. Because I did just teach math, but I didn't teach what math can open, what doors it can open for you. I didn't teach what algebra really can do for you, or that math is a layer, the basis for physics, for sciences, for anything. And what those students learned in my class was, here I am in 7th and 8th grade, and now I just don't have to take the 3 credits and 2 credits in high school, or whatever they need to take to graduate. They were asking these 2 women questions who were diverse backgrounds, these women, ethnically diverse, and you could tell that my students were asking, well, what do I take in high school? What do I do in college? And they even brought pictures from college. So my students changed, and my girls changed from and I kept them for 2 years, so I had 7th and 8th grade. I had my students for a 2-year time period. And I had literally parents call me and say, what have you done with my daughter who was scared of math in 6th grade and now wants to be an engineer? I mean, we need to have that professional development where teachers have experiences, students have experiences in the K-6 and then in middle school, because they're not going to high school just to get credits to graduate. They're going to be and to become. And that's what they need to be: literate science and for that matter, liberal arts, and literate in all subjects.
I'll make this part quick to finish on to the next question, but next year actually I'm going to be working with elementary teachers as part of a Connect to Science program through PSU, and the goal really is to how do you provide the support that they need, because elementary teachers, you know, they are kind of by themselves. They're supposed to teach all subjects, and if they're not comfortable with science, or they don't have easy access to equipment, or it's just easier to grab a textbook than to pull out a bunch of things to go outside. There's a lot of reasons why the science gets skipped over, and it's really knocking down those barriers and supporting them in using science as that integrated pathway where they can do some math and do the English, and so they're taking care of all core subjects and skills, but using science as a vehicle for that. So in elementary school, I just can't imagine science, and as a high school teacher, I mean, science is fun. It's not reading something out of a book.
Please.
Hello, I'm Vanessa Colon. I'm working with Congressman Serrano, and I recently saw a briefing on education from pre-K and kindergarten. They were talking about how education in those sectors now and in general it's becoming less developmentally targeted, and that it's becoming more scripted and didactic. And you cited how by 3rd grade children just lose that light and that interest in learning. So I mean, do you see that a need for a new approach in general of just the way that we teach?
Yes. yes. One of the things that has happened in the last 4 to 5 years that I've seen, and I can only really speak to Alaska, but some of the mandates that came down were, you will use this reading program, you will use this learning your alphabet program, and it took the joy out of learning to become engaged in books and stories, and it was every teacher in a few places, it was a reading first program, and you're all on the same page at the same time, and this is first grade and everybody's going to learn to read by a certain time. Well, we know developmentally not everyone learns to read, just like not everyone learns to do certain kinds of math at certain times, right? So I am in agreement that we need a developmentally appropriate approach. And that, again, is where I'll speak to, I think, teachers and people who understand child development should be in those policy-making positions, or they should be asking people, what is right? How do children learn? What are those really, really early steps to education that we should be taking so that all kids are ready for kindergarten when they come, but they're not ready because they can say their alphabet and know their letter sounds? That's not appropriate. What is appropriate is to have a love of learning and to be engaged with books and real things and to be outside and to be involved with lots and lots of adults who care about them. So, yeah, I have a lot of opinions about that.
Anybody else with opinions on that? Well, let's go to the lady there and then the gentleman there.
Hi, Della Cronin with Washington Partners. And actually, my question is more for Karen, because you spoke about how you were, when you were a novice teacher, you were put in the barrio, so to speak, which is something that we've heard on the Hill. They have, concern about that practice, not only for the students in the classroom, but also the attrition rates for teachers who end up in that situation. But since you're a person who has seemingly come out of it unscathed, and hopefully the students that you left behind were better for the experience, how do you feel about that conversation? And do you think it's NCLB is a law of one size fits all, and maybe that wasn't the case in your situation? So now that there's more amplification around this assertion from the Obama administration, Secretary Duncan, what's your perspective? And
my baptism by fire.
Right.
you want to see my scars? No. I think that for me personally, I had been in the workforce for about 7 years, so I wasn't fresh out of college, and I was older, flat out. So for me, I had experience under my belt, so I came into education with a different, I guess, eyesight, with different experiences, and it was a very, don't get me wrong, it was a difficult experience. My sister was a teacher, and I relied every day on, she was my roommate, and she just hated every minute, I'm sure, but every single day she had to pick me up off the ground. The new teacher or the teacher who's in an inner city experience, you are 100% survival mode. And what we don't understand is we need to support those teachers more than ever. I was grateful because I did have support from my sister, but I also had support from the school, but probably not enough. And so with No Child Left Behind, I think it's become not only survival mode in schools like that, but you're really kind of looking at, oh my gosh, we have one more year to show improvement. If we don't finish, then we've had our 3 years, and who knows? Possibly, maybe we should, take a bailout, or not bailout, but excuse me, forgive me, but probably we should declare bankruptcy in our inner schools and have them be restructured and be forced to restructure. I think that it's the support more than ever that's needed in those schools. They don't have the resources, they don't have the technology, they don't have the time to collaborate, to work together, to support each other. The other thing I would say is paying teachers more money is not going to be your answer. So if you think, oh, we'll just give them more money, oftentimes it's not pay, it's the environment in which they work, and we have to change that environment. We cannot, the other thing that's very important here is you cannot have a teacher who has a teacher load of 180 kids a day. And a lot of the PISA report comes out, and there's a contradiction that I call it the Gates contradiction, that a quality teacher, a very dedicated teacher, can handle more students in the classroom. While that may be true, they cannot have a class load of 180 students. That is likened to you all having from 7:30 in the morning here on the Hill until 2:45 in the afternoon, a meeting every single hour with 45 people that are on their Blackberries texting somebody about legislation. And oh, by the way, you have to run that meeting every single hour. And then only after that at 2:45 do you get a break. Then all those parents came in from the meeting. So it's, you know, if you think about that.
Then you grade the reports.
But you
For
think
3
about it. I mean,
hours at least.
180 kids, 360 parents. You're killing yourselves. We just recently had a conversation with a KIP teacher who was in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and he had an experience in Arizona. Went to teach in New Orleans. He said he literally was burnt out after half a year. He had from 12 hours in the classroom, parent requests. It was just absolutely, we're killing our teachers. And
Well, he quit mid-year.
he quit mid-year. But the other interesting thing is, when we talk about a teacher shortage, we actually have the teachers that are teaching now, but because of the environment, they're not staying. I mean, I will go back next year to my classroom environment, and I've already been told that I'm teaching science next year as well as math. I'm teaching 7th and 8th grade blends, new science curriculum, new math curriculum, and I don't even know science. I mean, I do, but I'm not qualified to teach science. But because of the situation in my district, that's what I'm going back to. Now, am I thinking twice about it? No, not really, because that's my love is teaching, and I want to prove to everyone it can be done. But anyway, so.
Just a couple quick comments on Karen's statements there. One is some of the schools that I've seen that are the flunking schools, if you look at their turnover rate, it's like 70% plus. So firing all the teachers happens every year by self-doing it, right? People quit. And my own experience tells me that troubled schools are often troubled because no one's there long enough to develop any consistency and a culture, right, where people care. And so by throwing out the 3 people who really might care about the school isn't necessarily a good thing. And then around teacher workload, I mean, it really is expected in some places where you work a full day and you grade your papers, and you might get 20 minutes for lunch, and you might have 15 minutes to grade papers at the end of the day, right? It's not sustainable to do the job, and that's where burnout comes, is when the expectations far exceed the capacity of someone to do the job. So Karen's idea of if you have 180 students, which is common in many big schools, I mean, you think if you spent 1 minute grading a paper, student paper every day, that's 3 hours of grading without a break. And that's 1 minute per paper, which is not very long, right? Typically, science people are doing lab reports, that kind of thing. You're talking 5, 10, 15 minutes a paper. And so that kind of workload is just overwhelming. So I think having what the federal government could really do is by having a standard that said, you know, everyone who's teaching an 8-hour or your teaching day should have at least an hour, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours for prep and planning time and meeting time. Okay, there should be a certain limit on how many students that someone could take. And Kent, your comment, I know about the PISA, and we've talked about this with larger class sizes. If you have someone grading your papers, larger class sizes can make a difference. I mean, you might be able to handle more students without much effect because it's that in-class time where you're able to see students, right? But when you're talking about the difference between 30 kids and 40 kids, and you add on that grading layer, it's significant numbers of hours per week different. And over the course of the year, it's truly, it's amazing. And so what doesn't get done, doesn't get done.
Let's go to the gentleman in the back there.
I'm Jay Liebe from the National Academy of Sciences and the National Research Council. I was delighted to hear about HB 1709 because what we're talking about here is a systems issue where what we're having are different agencies that are not working together, and the efforts are duplicated, replicated, and it's highly inefficient. Another major part of the system that I think we need to be thinking about is the fact that higher education and K-12 education are considered completely separately. So the Higher Education Act is reauthorized at a different time, and there are different priorities than the reauthorization of elementary secondary education acts. And yet they intersect, those two systems intersect in such great ways that many of these issues could be addressed if we could begin to think about how to make a Venn diagram rather than two separate circles. As an example, when we talk about elementary school teachers being afraid of science, every single one of those teachers has taken a science course in higher education. I spent 20 years as a college faculty member, so we have to begin to figure out how we can begin to get higher education more involved in K-12 education and think about those needs as part of what faculty members in higher education do. Because their rewards are completely different, their expectations are completely different, their recognition is completely different. It's not through teaching future teachers, particularly in science or math. It's in doing some things that are completely different. There are wars that go on between schools of education and the arts and sciences. This is also part of the system, and I don't think we consider it nearly enough. And I'm wondering how people in Congress can begin to think about these kinds of issues so that we can begin to solve some of the problems that you're all facing, which I think in very large part are a direct consequence of having these two systems so separate and disparate. How do we empower teachers through the kinds of education that they receive in pre-service education and not just in what they have to do and get in in-service education?
Yes.
I was just speaking for myself, by the way.
There was a how in there. It's really important to have those relationships worked out, and so part of this Enhancing STEM Education Act, where one part is the federal government coordination of the federal STEM education priorities, there's a second section that creates a STEM education consortium of states to get together and look at these issues, both from a business perspective, so the industry stakeholders for the workforce, for the academic institutions, for them to have high quality undergraduates entering into their post-bachelorette programs for PhDs, et cetera, and teacher training. So how do we get them all to align? When we look at the role of the federal government, we often get into the role of the locals and the states, and what is the appropriate balance for overstepping the federal role, or maybe we might say, where should the federal role be? One way to help do that is to incentivize from the federal government states working together around this issue and other critical ones that really affect education around STEM in the schools. And so within that legislation, creating the state consortium empowers this group to make it at the state level rather than a top-down approach. They can activate all the local stakeholders, work together to identify what the needs are and some of the solutions, the hows, to getting there. And so that's a second part of that piece of legislation, the first one being around the federal coordination. And the other one that might come up a little bit later is on sharing promising practices, and we need a way to kind of get that information out there both to the educators at the universities and teachers. So if I have English language learners and I'm trying to work with them on algebra, and they have come as first-generation immigrants and they learned math in another country, which sets up problems in a different way, I may think they don't have the content, when in reality they're just approaching it in a different way. They're doing a different kind of division. The federal government supports research and on how to work with those students, but it's hard to find, and it's sometimes spread across agencies. So putting it in one place is helpful, and so my boss will be reintroducing that. I'm not supposed to wear my legislative hat, but we're reintroducing the bill soon, and it'll make this information mandatorily Googleable or Yahooable or whatever the next iteration of internet search engines might be. But also a really cool component is to make it so that third-party developers can develop applications around that information that the federal government and others are repositing, so that if you wanted to be an elementary school teacher, or if you were one, and you had microscopes and running water, but you didn't have gas, you could tick off boxes. You might imagine an application like this, like for cooking, where you give the ingredients and you say what kind of food you want to make, and it gives you results back on what you can do with those ingredients. So in my classroom, what do I have? What's the topic I want to teach? What's the grade level? Show me what the federal government's got or what states have or universities have developed so that I can then look at implementing it in my classroom, in my situation. We don't have anything like that now, but this stuff is out there. If we put it in one place, we change around technically so that folks can build on it, we can create or empower groups to create some really powerful tools around that. So that's sort of a long-winded answer.
I think, Jay, you're absolutely right that we do separate, and by some of our actions, we confirm those separations. And I think that there are so many different entities working to solve education. You have it, like Ed was saying, at your state level, you have your P16 councils, you have your P20 councils, you have your foundations, you have your private corporations, you have the federal government, you have your agencies. You have so many entities who often do not have the same objective in mind. And in some senses, they're actually diverging. They're going in 2 different, 3 different, 19 different directions. What I have seen in my last 2 years is that the federal government, while yes, there is separation, the states versus federal government, they are not getting to the classroom level. They are not getting, whether it's an agency-supported research, that dissemination of that agency of how students learn is not getting to the classroom. We need to get the research that is happening at these different agencies in the classroom to the teacher. There are, as we mentioned, teachers are absolutely exhausted teaching and helping to communicate those to educate students. However, they have some brilliant, exciting, innovative ideas that somehow we need to help those ideas and innovations bubble up to the surface. I found that our agencies are so close to K-12. They're very open to institutes of higher education and larger consortia to apply for grants, but it's not the K-12 teacher or K-12 district. Only if you are connected with an institution of higher education are you able to apply for grants. I will say, in support of a few teacher programs, the Einstein Fellowship that we have was a individual teacher. So we all applied to be a part of this program, and it's a federal program. So we're the anomaly, I guess, to that. We need more of that. We need more teachers that have access, open access to the programs where agencies who do their best, who know their stuff the best, can get to those classroom teachers. But as I mentioned also, there are corporations. Cisco, if you know anything about Cisco, has created a white paper and dealing with technology in classroom. It's a fabulous white paper. You should find it, Google it, Cisco white paper. It's extraordinary. I think it's 21st century learning in Cisco. Another foundations they're putting interactive whiteboards in the classroom. An example, in Denver, Colorado, a mortgage foundation has put over 1,000 interactive whiteboards in the classroom, and they're changing the way teachers are teaching. It's not the whiteboard, but it's the collaboration that comes through the technology for the digital native students that has absolutely changed that inner city, urban, and suburban school and the connectivity that they're having. So I think our government needs to start doing that and step outside of the box. Yes, we're a huge entity, but we can, I think, little by little, start to move that engine and get, as I mentioned earlier in the opening, that we need our government to start with the 21st century skills and start to collaborate and coordinate and think of creative innovation solutions. I do want to say that I felt inside the Beltway, if you will. I've always wanted to use that term. Anyway, I won't be able to use it later, but inside the Beltway in DC, we have this feeling that we have spent billions on education. It is true. We have given $100 billion to education, but those are through the Department of Education and formula grants. And then we have this $5 billion race to the top. But what the true reality is, our schools are so financially strapped. This will be a challenge to be able to use it for this innovation that we want and we wish and we desire. We really need to think, this is literally, as I mentioned, I'm going back to school district, I will not have a cost of living raise. I won't have any raise. I have given away benefits. Our union has decided that that's what we're going to do because to try and stave off layoffs, we're taking hits. We're taking days off school. We're taking hits. You know, it sure would have been nice, but unfortunately it's not at the ground level. It's still a survival with schools, and it will continue to be. So as an education, we need to, yes, create the collaborations, but we need to leverage more and more and leverage the federal government and merge, because our students go from elementary to middle to high school to higher education, and that should be seamless. We should not segregate those.
Well, we have actually let ourselves slip past the appointed hour because this is such a rich panel, and we'll want to return to this subject in the not too distant future. But before we go, I just want to say a special thanks for David Klaus. David is the consulting director of the Wilson Center on the Hill, and Liz Byers, who's standing over there in the back, is a critical element of Wilson Center on the Hill, and Jacqueline Nader, who I think is back there and has been working on education as well as supporting the Wilson Center on the Hill effort. I just want to thank you all for coming. We'll see you June 23rd for Canadian Banks and June 26th for Development. Please join me in a round of applause for an outstanding panel.